What does it mean when one country buys more than 13 times what the other country buys back? In 2025, Burkina Faso bought about $68.2 million in goods from the United States. The United States bought only about $5.1 million from Burkina Faso. Two numbers, one enormous gap. And behind that gap is a question far bigger than trade statistics. Why is Burkina Faso still buying so much more value than it sells back? And more importantly, could that begin to change? Because today, Burkina Faso is not only talking about sovereignty, it is trying to produce more food, strengthen agriculture, expand local processing, and keep more economic value inside the country. Under Ibrahim Traore, that ambition is becoming part of a much larger national conversation. Not about closing the door to the world, not about ending trade, but about changing Burkina Faso's position inside that trade. Before we go further, tell us which number surprised you more, $68.2 million or $5.1 million?
And if you want clear, in-depth analysis on Burkina Faso, African economics, and the decisions shaping the Sahel, subscribe and stay with us.
Because the real mystery may not be what Burkina Faso is buying from America today. The real mystery is what those purchases could help Burkina Faso build tomorrow. And if that answer leads back to farms, factories, and African markets, could this trade imbalance become the starting point of something much bigger? The trade gap looks simple at first. Burkina Faso buys far more from the United States than the United States buys back. But the deeper story is not only about the size of the gap, it is about the kind of value moving in each direction. When Burkina Faso imports machinery, vehicles, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, industrial equipment, or other higher value goods, it is paying not only for the physical product, it is paying for engineering, processing technology, packaging, logistics, branding, and the accumulated value created before that product ever reaches Burkina Faso. Now look at the other side of the relationship. Burkina Faso has agricultural strength, cotton, sesame, livestock, grains, mangoes, shea, other crops and raw materials that can support trade. But raw production and finished value are not the same thing. That distinction is where the mystery begins to change. Imagine a sesame farmer in Burkina Faso. He prepares the land, he plants, he waits through the season, he protects the crop, he harvests, he fills the sacks, then the crop leaves the farm. And from that moment forward, a new chain begins. Someone cleans it, someone grades it, someone stores it. Someone processes it, someone packages it, someone brands it, someone transports it, someone sells it into a higher value market. The farmer may have produced the crop itself, but much of the economic value can be created after the crop has already left his hands. That is the difference between producing a commodity and controlling more of the value chain around that commodity. And for Burkina Faso, that difference could become one of the most important economic questions of the coming years. Because the goal cannot simply be to grow more. If the country grows more but continues exporting mainly raw agricultural products, then much of the higher value activity still happens somewhere else. The real transformation begins when production is connected to storage, processing, packaging, transport, and larger markets. This is why the trade gap with the United States should not be read too quickly as a sign of weakness. Some imports can be consumption, but some imports can also become productive tools. A tractor is not only an imported machine if it raises agricultural output. Fertilizer is not only a purchase if it increases productivity. Industrial equipment is not only a foreign expense if it supports local processing. Technology is not simply dependence if it helps build domestic capacity that did not exist before. And that is where the story turns. Because a country can import today in ways that help it produce more tomorrow. The question is, what happens next? Does the machine stay an imported machine, or does it become part of a new local industry? Does the fertilizer simply support one harvest? Or does it become part of a broader strategy to increase food security and commercial production? Does the truck simply carry goods into Burkina Faso? Or does it eventually carry more Burkina Bay products toward regional and international markets? This is the economic difference between permanent dependence and strategic investment. One consumes value. The other can help create future value. For Ibrahim Traore and Burkina Faso, that distinction matters. A policy of economic sovereignty cannot mean refusing everything from outside. No modern economy develops that way. The more realistic question is whether imported tools, equipment, and technology can be used to strengthen domestic production instead of replacing it. That is a much harder task, but it is also a much more serious one, and it brings the story back to the farmer. If that farmer produces more this year but still sells the same raw crop at the same stage of the chain, the country has made progress in volume, but not necessarily in value. If, however, the crop is stored locally, processed locally, packaged locally, transported by local farms, and sold into larger markets, then the same harvest begins supporting many more people. Farmers, drivers, technicians, warehouse workers, processors, traders, exporters. That is how one agricultural product can begin supporting an economic ecosystem. And that may be where Burkina Faso's biggest opportunity lies. Not simply in selling more, but in doing more before the product is sold. If you were advising Burkina Faso, where would you put the next dollar? Into more production, more processing, or better access to markets? Because the answer to that question may decide whether today's trade imbalance becomes a permanent condition or the beginning of a completely different economic story. And that leads to the next question. What happens when Burkina Faso stops asking only how much it can grow and starts asking who captures the value after the harvest? Now, the story moves from trade statistics to the ground, to the fields, to the roads, to the storage building, to the machines that can determine whether a harvest leaves Burkina Faso as a raw commodity or becomes the beginning of a larger industry. This is where agriculture becomes more than food. It becomes strategy. For years, many African economies have faced the same basic challenge. They can grow the crop. They can raise the livestock. They can extract the raw material. But too often, the highest value stages happen somewhere else. Processing happens somewhere else. Packaging happens somewhere else. Branding happens somewhere else. And by the time the finished product reaches a consumer, much of the final value has been added far from the farmer who began the entire chain. Burkina Faso now has an opportunity to challenge that pattern, not by abandoning trade, not by closing its borders, but by doing more before the product leaves the country. Imagine the full chain. A farmer prepares the soil. Seeds go into the ground. Water reaches the field. A tractor moves across the land. Workers gather the harvest. The crop goes into storage. From there, it moves into cleaning, sorting, processing, packaging, transport, distribution, and eventually a market. Every one of those steps can create work. Every one of those steps can create income. Every one of those steps can create skills. And every one of those steps can allow Burkina Faso to keep a larger share of the value generated by its own production. That is the difference between simply having agriculture and building an agricultural economy. And this is where the role of policy becomes important. Ibrahim Traore cannot personally plant every field. He cannot operate every processing machine. He cannot load every truck. And no government can create prosperity by speeches alone. But governments can change the environment in which farmers, workers, traders, and entrepreneurs operate. They can support mechanization. They can improve irrigation. They can invest in roads. They can improve storage. They can encourage local processing. They can make it easier for goods to move from rural production zones into larger markets. And they can decide whether national strategy is built around exporting raw products or around creating more value before export. This is the real turning point. The farmer who once sold a sack of sesame as a raw crop may one day become part of a much larger chain. The crop can be cleaned locally, processed locally, packed locally, moved by a local transport company, handled by warehouse workers, inspected by technicians, sold by a Burkinabe company, and then carried into a regional or international market. The crop has not changed, but the economy around the crop has changed completely. One harvest is no longer supporting only one farmer. It can support drivers, mechanics, machine operators, warehouse workers, packaging teams, accountants, traders, exporters, small business owners, and young people looking for a reason to believe they can build a future without leaving their communities behind. This is where national pride becomes more than a slogan. It becomes visible. You see it when a machine is operating inside Burkina Faso instead of somewhere overseas. You see it when a truck leaves a processing center carrying a finished or semi-finished product. You see it when farmers know that the value of their work does not end the moment the harvest leaves the field. And you see it when a country begins to understand that sovereignty is not only about who owns the land. It is also about who captures the value created from that land. That is why agriculture could become one of the most important economic battlegrounds in Burkina Faso's transformation. Not a battlefield of anger, a battlefield of production, of efficiency, of storage, of processing, of market access, of discipline, of patience, and of competition. Because pride without productivity cannot change a trade balance. But productivity connected to processing and markets can begin changing the structure underneath that balance. The deeper ambition is simple. Do not grow more only for somebody else's factory. Do not produce more only to remain at the lowest value stage. Grow more, process more, move more, sell more, and keep more of the value at home. If trade is a ladder, then Burkina Faso now has to decide how many rungs it intends to climb. And that decision will determine whether the agricultural push becomes only a story of bigger harvests or the foundation of a much larger industrial transformation. Because processing food at home is only the first step. The bigger question is what happens when those Burkinabe products begin looking for larger markets. Could the next stage of Burkina Faso's economic rise be decided not in the field, but on the roads, at the borders, and inside the markets of Africa itself? If Burkina Faso can move from producing more to creating more value around what it produces, the consequences would reach far beyond agriculture. They would reach families. They would reach towns. They would reach transport routes. They would reach young people deciding whether they see a future at home. And they would reach the government itself, because a country that produces more of what it needs and earns more from what it sells gains something extremely important: more choices. That is where the next stage of this story begins. Imagine a rural community where agriculture is no longer only about planting and harvesting. A storage center appears nearby. A small processing facility begins operating. Trucks arrive more regularly. Mechanics are needed. Technicians are needed. Bookkeepers are needed. Packaging workers are needed. Drivers are needed. Traders are needed. Suddenly, one field is connected to many different kinds of work. This is how agricultural development can begin changing social expectations. A farmer's son may not need to choose between repeating exactly the same work or leaving the region entirely. He could become a machine operator, a warehouse manager, a transport coordinator, a processor, a quality control worker, an exporter. A farmer's daughter could become an agronomist, an accountant, a food entrepreneur, or a manager inside a business that did not exist a generation earlier. That is how economic transformation becomes visible in ordinary life. Not through slogans, through new choices, through new skills, through work that did not exist before. And this is also why processing matters so much. If Burkina Faso produces more cotton, sesame, grains, livestock, mangoes, shea, or other agricultural goods, production alone is important. But production is only one layer. The deeper opportunity is to connect that production to an expanding domestic economy, more storage, more local transformation, more packaging, better transport, better access to markets, and eventually a larger share of the final value remaining inside the country that could strengthen local businesses. It could increase demand for services. It could make agriculture more attractive to private investment. And it could create a stronger connection between rural production and urban economic growth. This is where the idea of self-reliance must be understood carefully. Self-reliance does not mean isolation. It does not mean Burkina Faso should stop importing machinery, technology, medicine, equipment, or specialized products. No serious modern economy works that way. The real goal is different. Import what helps you become more productive. Produce more of what you can produce competitively. Process more of what you already grow. And trade from a stronger position. That is a very different philosophy from simply trying to buy less. It is about becoming more capable, and capability changes politics. A government that depends heavily on imported essentials has fewer options when prices rise. A government that relies heavily on raw exports has fewer options when global commodity prices fall. But a country with stronger domestic production, more processing capacity, and more regional trade has more room to adapt, more room to negotiate, more room to choose partners, more room to resist bad terms. This is where Ibrahim Traore's broader economic message becomes important. The central question is not whether Burkina Faso can disconnect from the rest of the world. It cannot and it should not. The question is whether Burkina Faso can participate in the world economy with more leverage than before. Can it move from being mainly a buyer of higher value products to becoming a stronger producer of higher value products? Can it turn agriculture into industry? Can it turn industry into trade? Can it turn trade into greater economic independence? If that happens, the effect would not be limited to balance sheets. It would change national psychology. A country that sees more of its own products processed at home begins to see itself differently. A young worker standing beside locally operated machinery sees something different. A driver carrying Burkinabe goods toward a regional market sees something different. A farmer watching a crop move into local processing rather than leaving immediately as raw material sees something different. The message becomes simple. We do not only produce, we can transform. We do not only sell raw materials, we can create value. We do not only wait for markets, we can build connections to them. That is where national pride can become economically useful. Not pride for the sake of pride. Pride connected to discipline, production, skills, efficiency, and results. But there is another part of this transformation that could become even more important. Burkina Faso does not have to look only across the Atlantic. Its future markets may also be much closer: West Africa, the Sahel, neighboring economies, regional trade routes. If a processed Burkinabe product can reach consumers in nearby African markets, that can reduce dependence on a single destination and widen the country's commercial options. This is where stronger regional trade can become part of national sovereignty. One market gives you opportunity. Several markets give you leverage. And leverage matters because the more choices Burkina Faso has, the less vulnerable it becomes to any single buyer, supplier, price shock, or political pressure. This is the point where the original trade numbers begin to look different. $68.2 million going one way, $5.1 million going the other. At the beginning, those numbers look like a simple imbalance. Now they begin to look like a challenge, a benchmark, a starting position. What happens if Burkina Faso produces more? What happens if it processes more? What happens if it sells more regionally? What happens if more value stays at home before goods cross the border? The gap may not disappear quickly, but the structure underneath it could begin to change. And if that structure changes, Burkina Faso's relationship with the United States could change with it. Because a country that once arrived mainly as a buyer could gradually arrive as a stronger seller, a stronger producer, a stronger negotiator. And that raises the next question. If Burkina Faso begins keeping more value at home and offering more competitive products abroad, how will Washington, Europe, and the rest of Africa see that change? As a challenge, as an opportunity, or as the beginning of a much larger shift in how African economies position themselves in the world? If Burkina Faso begins producing more, processing more, and selling more value instead of mainly raw output, the consequences will not stop at its borders. They will reach Washington. They will reach Europe. They will reach neighboring African markets. And they will raise a larger question about what kind of economic role African countries want to play in the world. Start with the United States. A stronger Burkina Faso does not automatically become a threat to America. In fact, the opposite could also be true. A more productive country can become a better customer. A stronger agricultural economy can create more demand for machinery, more demand for technology, more demand for logistics, more demand for specialized equipment, more demand for investment. And if local processing improves, Burkina Faso could also become a more capable supplier of higher value goods. That creates a different relationship. Not aid on one side and dependence on the other. Not simply raw materials leaving Africa and finished goods coming back, but a more complex exchange between producers, buyers, investors, processors, and markets. That is why the question for Washington is not simply whether Burkina Faso buys less from America. The real question is whether Burkina Faso becomes more competitive while continuing to trade. Would American businesses see that as a challenge? Or would they see a stronger future partner with more purchasing power and more products to sell? That distinction matters because economic sovereignty does not have to mean economic separation. It can mean better terms, more options, and a stronger position at the negotiating table. Europe faces a similar question. For decades, many African economies have been connected to European markets through systems built around raw commodities, imported finished goods, aid, and external financing. If Burkina Faso starts climbing higher in the value chain, even gradually, that pattern begins to change. The country may still trade with Europe. It may still buy technology. It may still export agricultural products, but the goal becomes different. Do more before export. Keep more income at home. Create more local jobs. Build more domestic capability and negotiate from a position shaped by production rather than only need. But the most important reaction may not come from Washington or Europe. It may come from Africa itself. Imagine a farmer in Mali watching Burkina Faso invest more heavily in processing. Imagine an entrepreneur in Niger seeing new regional demand for locally transformed goods. Imagine traders in Ghana noticing that more products are beginning to move across neighboring markets. Imagine governments across the Sahel asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can keep more value from what it produces, why should we not try the same? This is how one national experiment can become a regional conversation. And that matters because Burkina Faso does not need to wait for the United States to become its only answer. Africa itself is a market. West Africa is a market. The Sahel is a market. Regional trade routes can become part of the country's strategy. If more African countries process more of their own crops, improve logistics, and trade more finished or semi-finished products with one another, the result could be much larger than a single bilateral trade balance. African raw materials could feed African processing. African factories could serve African consumers. African transport companies could connect African markets. And stronger regional businesses could then compete more effectively in global markets. That is a different model of development, not withdrawal from the world, a stronger entry into it, This is where Burkina Faso's transformation becomes strategically important. The country does not need to become self-sufficient in everything. No country is. The real strength comes from choosing where it can become more productive, where it can add more value, and where it can reduce unnecessary dependence. Agriculture may be one of those areas. Processing may be another. Regional trade may be another. And if those pieces begin working together, the original numbers could slowly change. $68.2 million in one direction, $5.1 million in the other. Today, that gap is large. But the future question is not whether Burkina Faso can erase it overnight. The future question is whether the country can change the structure that created it. Can more domestic processing raise the value of what Burkina Faso sells? Can stronger regional markets reduce dependence on distant buyers? Can productive imports help build the capacity that eventually supports more exports? Can the country move from selling mainly what comes out of the ground and the field to selling more of what happens after production? That is where the larger African story begins. Because if Burkina Faso can demonstrate that economic sovereignty means building capacity rather than simply rejecting outsiders, other African countries may study the model. Some may adapt it. Some may reject it, some may choose different sectors, but the conversation changes. The question is no longer only who will help Africa. It becomes what can African countries build, process, trade, and finance more effectively for themselves? And that is a much more powerful question. Africa does not have to disappear from the global economy. It has to climb higher inside it, higher in processing, higher in technology, higher in logistics, higher in ownership, higher in value. That is why Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation could matter far beyond its own borders. It is not only about farms. It is not only about trade statistics. It is about whether one country in the Sahel can change its role from mainly supplying raw value and buying finished value to creating more of that finished value at home. If that begins to happen, the world may not see Burkina Faso in the same way again. And neither may Africa. But one final question remains. Is Burkina Faso simply trying to reduce a trade imbalance, or is Ibrahim Traore trying to help the country change the economic role it has played for generations? Because the answer to that question will decide whether this becomes a temporary policy experiment or the beginning of a much larger turning point for Burkina Faso and perhaps for Africa itself. There is one danger in this story. It is the danger of believing that producing more automatically means becoming economically independent. It does not. A larger harvest can still leave a country vulnerable if the crop is exported raw. More farmland can still create limited value if storage is weak. More machinery can still disappoint if maintenance fails. More production can still struggle if roads, processing, financing, electricity, security, and market access do not improve with it. That is why the next phase matters so much. Burkina Faso cannot stop at growing more. It has to connect the field to the factory to the road to the market, and the market to a larger strategy. If that connection is not built, then the country may increase output without changing its position in the value chain. But if the connection is built, the result could be very different. More crops could support more processors. More processors could support more workers. More workers could support more families. More competitive products could reach more African markets. And stronger regional trade could give Burkina Faso more choices when dealing with larger economic powers. That is the real test. Not whether Burkina Faso can isolate itself, not whether it can stop buying from the United States, not whether it can reject the global economy. The test is whether it can participate in that economy from a stronger position. Now, return to the two numbers we started with. $68.2 million, $5.1 million. At the beginning of this story, those numbers looked like a warning, a large imbalance, a relationship in which much more value was moving in one direction than the other. But perhaps those numbers should also be seen as a benchmark, a starting point, something future generations can measure against. Because the real goal is not to reverse those numbers overnight. It is to change what sits underneath them. Higher agricultural productivity, more local processing, better storage, stronger transport, more skilled workers, more regional trade, more competitive businesses, and more value remaining in Burkina Faso before a product crosses the border. This is where the story of Ibrahim Traore becomes larger than one leader. A government can set direction. It can invest. It can change priorities. It can encourage production. But no leader can manufacture national transformation alone. Farmers have to produce. Workers have to learn. Entrepreneurs have to take risks. Technicians have to keep machines running. Traders have to find markets. And institutions have to make those connections work. That is how a country rises. Not through one speech, not through one announcement, not through one harvest, but through thousands of ordinary people becoming part of a larger economic chain. And perhaps that is the most important source of pride in this story. Burkina Faso does not need to defeat America. It does not need to defeat Europe. It does not need to prove that trade with the outside world is a mistake. The greater victory would be much more difficult to grow more, to process more, to trade more intelligently, to keep more value at home, and to meet the rest of the world with more choices than before. That is what real economic sovereignty could look like. Not isolation, capability, not anger, production, not dependence, option. And if Burkina Faso can build that foundation, the effect could reach far beyond its own borders. Other African countries will watch. Farmers will watch. Entrepreneurs will watch. Governments will watch. And they may ask themselves a question that could shape the next generation of African economics. Why export the raw beginning of the story when more of the ending can be written at home? So now I want to hear your view directly. If Burkina Faso had to choose one priority first, which should it be? Farming, processing, or regional trade? Write your answer in the comments and tell us why. If you believe Africa deserves more serious discussion about production, sovereignty, trade, and economic dignity, share this video with someone who follows the future of the Sahel. And subscribe if you want more clear, detailed analysis of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, and the economic decisions that could shape the region for years to come. A nation rises not only when it owns the soil beneath its feet. It rises when its people capture more of the value created by their own hands. That is the deeper question behind $68.2 million going one way and $5.1 million coming back. Is Ibrahim Traore helping Burkina Faso build the foundations of a more self-reliant economic future? And if Burkina Faso succeeds, could the lesson spread far beyond its borders and help redefine what economic sovereignty means for Africa? May God bless the people of Burkina Faso. May God bless Africa. And may dignity, discipline, production, and opportunity guide every nation seeking the strength to shape its own future.